Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Breaking Badness Cybersecurity Podcast, recorded on Monday, March 24th, 2025. I'm your co-host, Kali Fencl. With me is someone you may recognize, Daniel Schwabe, CISO and Head of Investigations here at DomainTools. And we're going to discuss a recent analysis done by the DomainTools Investigations team on domain registrars and disinformation. For that reason, we wanted to bring in a disinformation expert to accompany us in this conversation. We are so grateful to be joined by security researcher, Scot Terban. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Hello, hello.
Hello. Scot, you are the new guest on the show. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself for our audience?
Sure. Got into the computer security business back in the late 90s after a life in art and design, and got picked up by IBM Security and Privacy as the first really big jobs. Spent 6 years with them doing penetration testing, red teaming, stuff like that all over the globe. And almost 25 years later, I'm still in the business and evolved from doing pen testing, things like that, to more open source intelligence gathering and threat intelligence, that kind of stuff as it evolved over the years.
Awesome. And what's been your experience studying, analyzing disinformation?
It's easy to get very much a feeling of almost hopelessness studying disinformation. And a lot of it is to do with the openness of society, our society here, the openness of the internet, and just how much more prevalent it is now due to social media and our connectivity. So when you're looking at it from the perspective of, okay, you're trying to track it. Okay, you can track it. You can point things out. But if you ever start to think, how can we interdict this? How can we hopefully cut it off at the pass before it's too late, before too much is out there directing people in the wrong directions? You go, gee, I'm going to need a lot of help on that. How do you do that? So it's daunting. It really is. But I've been looking at this picture for years and years now. And having grown up in the 80s around the Cold War and having a fascination for it, because my father's side of the family comes from Ukraine. I've had first person experience with a lot of it. So it's an interesting field, but sometimes you kind of get a little low when you think about it.
For sure. We're saying this episode's not really going to be an upper.
I think that there's some hope,
Good.
and coming up with ways to detect maybe early. But yeah, it's a fire hose. And with social media, it's just you can track it, you can try to prevent it, but look at where we are now.
For sure. And I think this gets into the crux of what DomainTools Investigations does. Daniel, I think for any of our audience members that don't know, can you tell us a little bit about what that entity is?
Yeah, so DomainTools Investigation is our fairly new effort of bringing timely security research to the community, for the community, by the community. So it's an effort to publish relevant research that others can use without tying it to like products or, oh, look, cool, the thing what we did here. We believe that by identifying what's going on right now and publishing short to medium form content rather than 40-page white papers, etc., getting them out quickly and having the rest of the security defender community be able to benefit from it, we're banking that this is going to be good for everybody.
And what has the group worked on? We're going to talk about one piece today, but in addition to that, what else can you tell this audience about what the group has done?
Yeah, the best option is you would go to dti.domaintools.com and you see some of our pieces that we've published most recently. Chinese malware distribution sites is probably a big one. There's a two-parter on that and a few other things. So we try to keep it timely. We try to keep it relevant. If it's something that came up 6 months ago, unless there's something new to talk about, we're not going to bother with that.
Gotcha. Cool. So today we're talking about the specific piece that's domain registrars powering Russian disinformation, a deep dive into tactics and trends. So Daniel, can you provide an overview of this research and key findings?
Yeah, so one of the advantages we have here at DomainTools, I was just saying we're not going to talk big about our tools and data, but obviously we are in the business of collecting DNS-related metadata and information that can be used by defenders to either track an adversary or try to come up with ways to stay ahead of them. And so we have things like historical whois information. We have a huge passive DNS database that goes back 15 years. And using all those things, you can draw correlations and try to associate seemingly unrelated assets, such as domains that may at the face of it have nothing to do with them, but we might be able to tie them together based on additional information that we have available and made searchable. And so there's a consistent effort by adversaries to create domains and content on those domains with website templates, etc., to publish what seems like innocuous information, maybe like news adjacent. It's mostly generated by AI, or just blatantly copy stuff from legit outfits, but then at an opportune time, sprinkle in information, disinformation that they want people to believe. And this research digs into a little bit of how prolific these actors are, the techniques that they're using, and what to look for in case this is something that you're encountering.
Okay, excellent. And this question could be for either of you. What would motivate a researcher to look into domain registrars and disinformation? Like why would that be important for our audience to understand?
In 2024, a constellation of domains were detected as disinformation sites that were set up by the follow-up to the Information Research Agency in St. Petersburg. This new bunch of domains all emulated small hometown newspapers that didn't exist. They went and they created domains that were close to some known entities, but not typo squatting to the point where it was like one character off to get people to go to the wrong place. But these were just low-key, placed out there, and were pretty much disinformation wholesale. It wasn't that they had a lot of news stories that were legit, but they were taking their own commentary and putting it in there as stories. And they were using AI to generate a lot of that. So these were found to be disinformation sites. And this was a new approach for them. Before they had the IRA, but they were using social media. Now they're setting up domains. Interestingly enough, for me, that method harkens back to something that I did research on back in, I want to say 2018, 2019, where there was a leak. The Cardinal of the Kremlin's, Grey Cardinal's email spool was leaked onto the darknet. I got a hold of it. The Grey Cardinal is one of Putin's guys who's handling a lot of the Ukrainian disinformation and espionage, let's say. And so I got a translator, went through the spool, it was a big spool, and found documentation in there on how they were planning and actually set up news organizations in Ukraine, in Donetsk, and some of the other areas to feed that "We Are Russia" party line. And so this kind of follows that suit, but not as much thought went into it as the stuff in Ukraine back in the 18s. They really put a lot of money into it and setting up actual media organizations there. But this kind of tracks along with their thinking that if they can't get just social media interaction, they can also direct your traffic to a website that's theirs, captured, and putting out disinformation, all the better, and you can follow that stream. So there's going to be connections. Plus, with the advent of the ChatGPT, they can just pump this stuff out really fast. So there were about 8 or 10 sites. I can't remember exactly how many there were, but looking at them when they were announced that we'd found them, it was all very low end, but effective enough. It was a change. It was a change to, okay, let's create sites and fly-by-night news services.
Yeah, it feels like the techniques have evolved and sped up. And of course, generative AI of 2 or 3 years ago is not even in the same universe as what it is now. And we saw stuff that was written back then by AI, and it was like word salad and could possibly pass. And maybe an SEO bot would think this is interesting, but a human reading it would be like, what is this? And now you can have it write full-blown articles with references, whether they're made up or not is a different story. But the quality has gotten so much better. And these guys have certainly figured out how to massively horizontally scale that and just go out and register tons of domains and just pump this stuff out just to create that baseline of perceived credibility to establish their base essentially, and then push out the disinformation. When I was working back at University of Washington many years ago, working with Kate Starbird, one of the researchers there, who's like looking into sort of the early quantifiable disinformation, like try to get like an idea, how can we try to programmatically distinguish like regular real information from potential manipulated information. And that was really interesting. This is a long continuation thereof.
Yeah, they have an 80-20 mix usually, Russia. So 80% may be legit stuff, the 20% that kind of sneak in there. These sites, I went back recently for the Doppelganger, and the majority of the sites are down, or they're still up, but they're not being updated. The only one that is Florida, the Florida Sentinel site. I want to go look a little bit deeper and see why. Are they getting traction? Are they getting like comments or something? But yeah, as of a week ago, they were still updated.
Doesn't Florida have an election coming up, or am I misremembering?
I don't know. Do they?
Yeah.
It might be that's the reason, but it is an enclave for certain thought. Yeah, they could be pumping that up. But yeah, it's interesting to see the change. And it gives me pause to think that it'll be interesting to see if they break this down into smaller units going after different states like this in the future for different reasons.
Absolutely. And would you say AI is the biggest change in how disinformation has evolved, or is there anything else in the cybersecurity landscape that would have altered the trajectory of disinformation?
I think the AI makes it much more of something where they can spin stuff up really quickly. They can pump stuff out really quickly. It can be as close to the truth as you want, or it can be a little fuzzy on purpose. You can also emulate styles of writing and languages. You can easily get it to translate into whatever language you want on the fly. So I think it's from the perspective of having a smaller IRA group, let's say. IRA had a building and they had, I don't know how many people working there back in the day. Now you could do it with a couple guys.
Just a couple guys.
Yep. Asymmetric warfare, really.
When AI wasn't quite as powerful just yet for generative content, there was a lot of replication, duplication, just for economies of scale. And of course, search engines hate that. If they find two sites that are posting the same context, they both get devalued in terms of SEO. And now basically you can crank out high volume content that is unique to each site. So each individual site will possibly rank pretty highly and not cannibalize itself. So I think that's a big change as well.
For sure. In this particular research, Daniel, we talk about homoglyph attacks and typo squatting. Can you talk a little bit more about how these are employed in these specific campaigns?
Yeah, so typo squatting would be, there is a legitimate, tried and true news source, and that might be like an RE or an ER that people commonly mistype. And so they look for that and see if the domain is available, and then basically put up a clone of the original site, intending that if somebody does typo there, they get most content that they're expecting, and then sprinkle in the disinformation. And so people are like, wait a second, is this a BBC site? That's saying terrible things. Like, okay, homoglyph, that's internet nerdery, but basically more than a few years ago, some years ago, internationalized domain names were introduced. Historically, it was just the basic alphabet, no special characters or anything, since the internet originally was very US centric. So English language type was always preferred as far as domains go. But with the advent of IDNs, internationalized domain names, you can use native script, Cyrillic or umlauts in German. Those are all now possible in domain names. The adversaries have figured out that, I could possibly register New York Times and substitute one of the letters with, let's say, a Cyrillic lookalike letter. It's an internationalized domain name, but at the face of it, in the browser address bar, it basically looks indistinguishable. This technique has been used with other nefarious activity too. For example, phishing against like Amazon. We've seen some where the A was a Cyrillic A, has been replaced. They get a TLS certificate, so a little padlock shows up. Oh, it's secure. So those are common techniques, but we also see them used in these disinformation campaigns to approximate a real news source as closely as possible to then manipulate what's actually being displayed, which is usually a healthy mix. Scott said 80-20. They'll copy, sometimes even in real-time update. When the real site updates, they'll just pull the content over and then sprinkle in their 20% where they want to stir the pot.
How on the ball do they have to be to do that in real time? Or is it automated?
Yeah, it's pretty automated. You do something once, do it manually, do something twice, you automate it. Modern technology with scripting and automatically updating, and some of the stuff gets deployed into the cloud and it's Terraform, you push a button and then poof, it just happens. So that all of that technology has vastly improved over the last 5-ish or so years. So it makes this basically a trivial operation now.
And I was wondering, and I'm sure our audiences as well, which domain registrars are most frequently used by Russian actors, or what is this research stating in terms of the popularity of different domain registrars?
So in terms of registrars, we do name some in the piece, and I think it's fair because we saw a large accumulation of these domains being associated with those registrars. So we've got Namecheap, reg.ru, that's no surprise, Public Domain Registry, Two Cows, Epic. Epic is in a whole another category of its own. So these appear to be, in the research that we did, the top offenders, if you will. I want to say registrars are in a tough business. The margins are basically non-existent, and you make money by cranking out as many of these registrations as possible. Could they do a better job vetting some of that stuff? Yeah, I think so, but I'm also sympathetic to their business model and their volume, that it's really hard at scale to detect this proactive, like at time of registration. Now, after the fact, when it turns out those are malicious domains or misinformation, gets tricky, right? Because United States, freedom of speech, gets really hard to legislate that sort of thing. Other countries have different approaches to that, but it's pretty difficult to go after registrars for a fake news site, misinformation site, because it's probably not breaking any law. Copyright, maybe, if they're pulling in duplicating content, but then there's a fair use claim, which is probably pushing it. But everything takes a long time, and the registrar might ultimately decide like they're not going to take any action. So that really makes things tricky. But in terms of the sort of favorite registrars of what we find in this research and the disinformation campaigns that we were looking into, those appear to be the ones.
Mm-hmm. And I was going to ask, are there measures that domain registrars can take to prevent these kinds of things from being exploited for disinformation? But it sounds like it's a challenge. Would you both say that?
Yeah, it's a challenge. And as far as interjecting, the most you could do is just call them out. Say, hey, this site isn't legit. Buyer beware, so to speak. But like I said, even those sites that Doppelganger had up in 2024, they're still up. They're just not getting updated. So they haven't been taken down. Nobody's forced it. And people may still be reading the one in Florida, even though it's been in the news that it's disinformation. Caveat emptor.
Part of the reason we decided to publish this research is exactly that, to raise the awareness, to get people talking about it and be like, oh, maybe my local news source isn't so local, and maybe I should think twice when I read, no, whoa, this is out there. Just raising the awareness that this is still happening, that this exists, is a big part of why we decided to publish this.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, because my next question is obviously, how does this impact public trust?
Between social media and sites like these that were used in Doppelganger, it can be used to shape comment, shape people's attitudes. Going back to the Florida example, say that there is that election coming up, and I'll have to go back and look and see if they're doing a lot more political stuff for local election type stuff. Maybe they're driving that and look at, okay, why would they be driving for any particular candidate, if that's the case at all? The thing about Russian disinformation, for the most part, is against the United States in particular, but everywhere else, the last 10, 20 years, it's to cause friction, to cause people to not have comedy, So this goal would be just to cause static and noise and get everybody upset and going in different directions, so we don't have a single like mind. If it is down to the point where they're looking to affect change in a particular small area for some reason, let's look at what that reason is. But generally, it's a lot of noise. So on the larger scale, when you look at it, things like COVID-19 vaccination stuff and everything that happened since the advent of the Trump administration taking power the first time, and before that, for the run up to the presidency, that shaping of the narrative and that fractiousness was their goal, to get those people energized for this particular misinformation and to cause that fraction to make us inert in a lot of ways. And Russians' disinformation goes back in the 80s. They actually managed to get a story from backwater press all the way to the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather on the CIA actually creating AIDS. It was called Operation Infection with a K. So you can all look that up. That's the kind of thing that they tried to carry out even back then, and that's just to cause that friction and have us all over the place so we can't act effectively.
Yeah, Scott, you mentioned earlier social media, which of course is a big amplifier because it's a quick way to reach a lot of people real fast. And then you post links on there and drive them to your sites. There seems to have been a definite sea change in the last 3 to 6 months where, for example, Facebook has removed the ability to fact check. And then for a while it was going to be like crowdsourced fact checking. And now that seems to have gone away or at least been deprioritized. And so it's a lot easier for these actors to put stuff out without being directly challenged. That's another thing where how things have gotten more difficult. Twitter has gone a certain way and it's basically a free-for-all now. Still plenty of people using it, but I stopped using my Twitter account years ago because reasons, but every once in a while I'll still check in and it's just like pretty terrible, the echo chamber that's going on there. And the thing with disinformation, you don't have to be right all the time. You just have to create a reasonable doubt, and together with certain rhetoric of calling things mainstream media or the legacy media, like this is a bad thing, and allow alternative voices. Okay, this is free speech absolutism, but you still can't yell fire in a crowded theater. So it's not absolute. And by emphasizing these quote unquote alternative sources without any sort of vetting or fact checking involved there really feeds the purpose of these disinformation sites because it makes their life a million times easier now.
Yeah, and social media is somewhat ephemeral, like in a Twitter or even a Mastodon, you scroll, right? Facebook is a little more static, but I think there's more scrolling going on there too. I gave up Facebook many moons ago before it became a horrible place, but I just felt it was too much information that they wanted. But if you can get people to pivot away from that scrolling to a static site that you can scroll, but it's there all the time and you can concatenate all of it together, all the better for them.
What about international relations? What would you say this research shows for the broader implications? Like we've talked about what it looks like domestically. What about internationally?
I'll just use case in point Ukraine. Everything that's happened since Putin invaded has a disinformation component online and on social media and in the media, depending on your media source, right? So it has been interesting and scary to watch Republicans go from being more hawkish against communism to now cozying up to Putin and saying Ukraine doesn't need to be Ukraine. Maybe you can have a piece of Ukraine, give us your minerals, and then we'll broker a deal. But the disinformation fire hose is always there. So talking to people on the street, so to speak, if they're in their bubble on social media, Fox News, or any other news source like that is following that particular brand of mis and disinformation that they're getting from sources and propagating, that definitely has turned the tide on everyone who voted for Trump. They don't believe that Ukraine needs to be free necessarily, at least not with their votes. I'd like to see some polling and actual sitting down and talking to people, but this is the pivot that we've had. And a lot of that has to do with the disinformation that's come out of Russia against Ukraine, and that their position is that the Ukraine is Russia. It was Russia before, and now it's going to be Russia again. Whatever's next after that, who knows?
Yeah, and like strictly objectively speaking, the guidance that the current administration has put out, if you take it at face value, they've basically directed agencies like CISA, et cetera, to stop actively interfering or trying to push back on Russian influence operations. They've come out and said that. So whether that's actually what's happening or whatnot, we will see. But the fact that this was actually released and we're going to stop doing that, for me as a security professional, is greatly concerning because there is enough objective evidence and facts out there to say that Russian cybercrime is prolific and is targeting westernized countries. They tend to stay away from their own areas or anywhere where, let's say, Russian is spoken, because they get in trouble with their bosses. But everybody else is fair game. And if we're going to start officially not doing anything about it, it's going to make our lives in the private sector trying to defend businesses and individuals so much more difficult.
It's all not looking so good when it comes to our posture in the cyber warfare field, when you've stood down a lot of the planning of ops against Russia and CISA being neutered. The latest EO I saw news about that they want to foist most of the operational stuff to the states now instead of the federal government. I have yet to really see the EO or dig further into that, but that would mean that all these states would have to suddenly get competent about this, and it's trouble coming.
I worked for state government for many years, and so I'm not throwing any shade, but if that actually is what pans out, we're in trouble.
Yeah.
I think what I want to ask now is, Daniel, working with your team in creating this research, and Scott having read it and being an expert on disinformation, what is the path forward? Daniel, what do you want to see readers do with this information? First of all, maybe we'll start there.
Yeah, I think the best thing we can hope for is to raise the awareness and make people think twice, think more critically. That also appears to be something that's becoming sort of a rarity these days. Instead of just like reading something and taking it at face value and getting outraged over it, we think, wait a second, who might benefit from this and why? That's, I think, the best hope we can have, because in terms of active measures like blocking this kind of stuff, that's unfortunately a losing battle just because it's so massive and horizontally scaled. And also, if you're a private enterprise, you can block whatever you want. But certainly there are claims of quote unquote censorship and whatever, even though, again, private enterprise is free to do whatever the heck they want. They're not the government. The First Amendment only applies to the government in terms of not suppressing speech, but it often gets commingled. And of course, consumers can vote with their pocketbook. And if they believe or are being told that a certain social media entity or whatever is suppressing speech, then that's going to cost them money in terms of advertising losses, etc. So I am sympathetic to the larger problem, but I also think the pendulum has swung too far to the other end, and now it's just a free-for-all and everybody can. So in terms of our research, raising awareness, letting our colleagues in the defender space know that this still is a thing and they need to watch out for it, because from there to a creative phishing campaign is only like a very small step. And so therefore it's worth drawing attention to. But for the general public, the best I can hope is to raise awareness and make people a little bit more skeptical than they maybe have become over the last 5 years or so.
What does this research make you want to do as a next step as a security researcher?
I think that there's an opportunity, although it's been degraded now because we're losing things like VOA and the actual disinformation fighting unit within the CISA, stuff like that. If you can detect the trending on, say, Facebook or Twitter or whatever, there's a narrative, you can pivot from that, go to someplace like DomainTools, and start to look for like sites or maybe clusters of domains being set up, certs being set up that might have other domains, subdomains, whatever. So if you're investigating it, you can at least maybe get ahead a little bit and be ready and investigate it properly without being caught off guard. It would be nice if we didn't have to be fighting on our own to do this. If there were a government entity that were counter disinformation, then they could use these tools, this notion. But at this point, anybody doing research is probably going to be the ones using this kind of technology to go, okay, now I'm seeing this, like a phishing campaign or some of these other things. And I could foresee some of these domains, like in the ones for Doppelganger, they could be sold off eventually and then used for different purposes, criminal purposes. Because of the hybridization between the Russian nation state actor types and criminal types that live in Russia or in one of the vassals of Russia, they could hybridize it into a phishing site or a watering hole, or, so paying attention to those sites, you could see it going different directions than just disinformation. If they get called out on it, They may just pivot to, okay, we'll use it for some other purpose.
Do you think that there are future trends you can gather from what you've read in this research, or is it too soon to say?
I think there's a possibility of trending where with the certain events, they could spin up the same kinds of sites. Now, I haven't looked at other domains in other countries for other news services. You could go out that way and see if they did the same thing against other countries as well. I could foresee them trying to synergize on that again, because these sites were so innocuous. It was easy to spin up, get the content out there, and hopefully affect people's mindsets before anybody knew about it. So why not do it again? They'll dip into that again.
So anybody who knows me knows that I'm at best an AI skeptic, generative AI, that is. I'm not a huge fan, although I've come around to some use cases where I'm like, okay, this might be okay. I would love to see, and I just unfortunately don't have the spare time myself right now, but I would love to see somebody generating an LLM that basically ingests all of the content from all of these sites that we know about and is looking for some kind of correlation, and maybe even develop a way where you can point it at a domain per se. It draws in all the information it can find. It does an analysis and gives you basically an objective reading. Yes, I've seen this in 7 other sites before, but not compared to these sites. And so give some kind of indication of level. You're going to be accused of, oh, you're like just going after these things for no reason, blah, blah, blah. But I think there is a component there because we're dealing with so much data where something like that could be useful. Completely unrelated to this, but in terms of like useful implementations of generative AI, somewhat relevant to our industry. So there's a guy on YouTube, shout out to Kit Boga, who's for the last like 8 years made his mission to tie up scam call centers. So they're like, oh, you have a virus, call Microsoft at 800, not Microsoft's number. And then they'll, try to draw you out and get you to pay, give you credit card information for like fake antivirus that never exists. It gets worse from there. And so he's made it a business and he records the videos and they're quite amusing and that makes some money on YouTube. So more power to it. But he just announced that he basically over the last year plus has built upon generative AI a bot framework where he can now spin up 100 personalities, real language, talk like real people, and it can listen and in real time interpret what the scammer is saying on the other end and reacts to it with sensical information. So it's not just a script where you can figure out, oh yeah, clearly this is just like recordings and it doesn't actually make sense. But the thing, he's posted videos about it, and I found it quite impressive how long these things manage to tie up a scammer and gets them really frustrated. And for every hour you can keep them on the phone, they're not scamming a real person. Disinformation adjacent, useful implementation of generative AI. So as defenders, I think we probably going to have to consider how to use things like that just because there's so few of us and so many adversaries.
Yeah, I think that moving forward, the generative AI and particularly around its ability to create video and audio now, that's leaps and bounds every day. It seems like it's getting better and better at. We could foresee disinformation being spun out in those models. So putting out YouTube videos, people look like real people and they're talking, and it'll get better and better so that it'll be harder for an average person to determine whether or not it's a real person who's in front of a camera doing a podcast, video cast, a YouTube video, and they could easily spin up those narratives really quickly. So if there were something in particular happening in, say, in the United States, and Russia wanted to perpetuate more fodder for that, let's say the Tesla stuff that's going on now where people are burning Teslas, or they're going and they're standing in front of Tesla buildings and preventing people from buying, just causing trouble basically, but causing that market share to go down. If Russia, say, wanted to double down on that, they could have videos spun up really quickly, and that's a lot better than just a static website. So we could probably foresee that kind of stuff coming down the pike too.
Fun fact, Kali's actually on vacation. This is an AI talking to us right now. Just kidding.
I was just going to say I would hold up today's newspaper, but I don't think it matters anymore.
There's actually a Google tool, and I forget the name of it. It's an AI tool, and you can give it a document, and it will make a podcast with 2 people talking about what you gave it. And I've used it. I've actually done it. When I was doing some work recently doing threat intel, I did the daily briefs. And for ha-has, because a friend of mine at Google said, you should try this. I took one of my daily briefs, I put it in there, and it made this MP3, and it was great. Now, the only problem with it nowadays is that every one of them sounds a lot alike. It's the same two voices, the same two people, so to speak, and it has the same kind of tenor. When it gets better, you could have multiple people. You could have different people every time. It sounded so much like a regular podcast and just two people talking that, yeah, the future is scary.
It's going to put a lot of men 18 to 25 who think they can do a podcast out of business.
Just think of the advertising. If somebody wanted to spin up a bunch of, let's just say, crappy YouTube video podcasting kind of stuff, but have advertising, they could just put out so much so quickly without much effort and make bank. So thinking about it from that perspective is one way, but for disinformation purposes and misinformation, that's the new tsunami, I think.
I'm quite frankly a little surprised that certainly in the most recent election, but even like contemporary elections going on, that there isn't more generative video AI where a facsimile of a politician, of a candidate is made to say certain things. We have seen that in some other countries in elections, but I haven't seen anything credible in the US, which thank goodness, but I'm also surprised. Does it not even need that? Or like, when are we going to see that?
Yeah, at the early stage of, just after ChatGPT came out, there was a darknet site that I was using where you could have text and it would speak that text in multitude of people's voices. So you could have Arnold Schwarzenegger say whatever you wanted. And it was pretty convincing for the most part. It had its moments where it wasn't. But even with the generative video for things like, I think wasn't there a one for Biden and one for Obama that was done, but you could tell the uncanny valley was still there. You got that back of your mind saying it's not real. When that's out the door and it's actually able to fool you, yeah, we're in trouble.
Cool.
On that note,
seriously. But this has been a really good conversation. I think it's an important one to have for sure. I want to thank you, Daniel and Scott, for being here today. We'll start with you, Scott, since you're a new guest. Where can people find you if they wanted to talk about this more?
Cryptia.com. It's KRYPT3IA on Mastodon. That's pretty much my blog is Cryptia.com. You can just look it up and I'm there. I've been blogging that for years.
Awesome. Daniel, what about you? Where can people find you and learn more about this and other research that DomainTools Investigations has done?
Yeah, the main one-stop shop is DTI, stands for DomainTools Investigations, dti.domaintools.com. We always post the latest stuff there right away. You can find me on LinkedIn. I have a newsletter there if you care to subscribe to that. It's monthly, so it's not overwhelming, but it's timely, is relevant. New edition is coming out here actually this week. And then on the socials, I'm at Dan on Security, not Dan and Security. The yogurt people are separate, but Dan on Security. I'm mostly on Mastodon. Pretty much have that reserved on all the socials, but I'm most active on Mastodon. So that's the best way to get a hold of me.
Thank you again to you both for being here today. Thank you to our listeners for joining us. And be sure to come back again next week for another all-new episode of the Breaking Badness Cybersecurity Podcast. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
That's about all we have for this week. You can find us on Twitter at DomainTools. All of the articles mentioned today will be included in our blog post, which can be found at blog.domaintools.com. Catch us every Wednesday at 9 a.m. Pacific Time when we publish our podcast and blog. That's it for this week. We'll see you again next week on another episode of Breaking Badness. Until then, remember, don't drink and click.